there so I can get my wheelie cart. They told me I had to give up my cart. I went, no way.
Your coffee is essential.
So I'm working my way over to the office. And I gave up. I said, you're not taking secrets from the I said, I know it's not you, but I'm not going to go on No, I just, it's everything in there. You're going in there without. No, I'm here. Are you teaching Monday? Thursday. Oh. So unless I stay over too, the other end. No, unless I stay over, then on a Thursday, usually I come up and take it out. We've been talking about it, too, walking. And when you come and do work, well, that's so nice of you guys to come in.
Alright, hit menu. And you should see something saying ISO select, or ISO set. And on H, you should see a section that you should for 4,600.
That's coming here. Well, it's I always make it around. There is some great like the 9th will come Monday after. Figure it out. Do I see you? No, tomorrow. Right? I see you tomorrow. Oh, no, nice to see you again. I think
Which does no trucker talk. No.
Hi there, good evening. Welcome to Constitution Day at MICA. My name is Furman DeBrabander. I am the event organizer for the college. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important discussion about the fate and resilience of democracy in the Trump era. I'd like to thank my department, Humanistic Studies, and our chair, Sahila Gausi, for supporting this event. Also thanks to David Bogan and Amy Hodges for their assistance in making this event happen. Thanks also to the events office on campus and the communications office and everyone who's helped bring this event together this year and every year. Special thanks this year to my colleague Colette VC Colors, who has planned a secondary event on Friday afternoon to continue the conversation here tonight. She'll convene panels to discuss restoring civic culture and educating for a democratic society, which will include a host of fascinating speakers, invite dialogue with the audience, and culminate in a conversation with Lester Spence from Hopkins and the artist Mel Chin on Friday evening. These intriguing conversations will be open to the public in this space. Copies of the schedule for this event can be found out in the lobby and online, of course. One last note before I hand it over to Susan Gehring from the ACLU of Maryland, our co-sponsor for this event. Ms. Joy Ann Reed will be signing copies of her book upstairs in the lobby after the event. Thank you.
In 2015, in the wake of Freddie Gray's death and the police killings of black men and women across the country, many of us marched. We marched and we chanted, "This is what democracy looks like." We did that because we were hopeful. There was a light being shown on at least a sliver of the vast experience of black people in America in the last 400 years, over 400 years, and we decided to join the demand for change. Since then, more recently as this week, there has been a series of officers who killed black men and women who have been acquitted. The acquittals have come in slowly but surely across the last couple of years. And we're pretty darn sure that that's not what democracy looks like. And if that were not enough, in January, of course, President Trump has become, since January, has become the icon and the embodiment of what democracy does not look like. Take, for instance, his flippant government by tweets, or his sheer number of bad policies. His policies range from his sham voter fraud commission that's really intended to suppress the vote nationwide. Then there's his attack on the media, and actually the attack on truth as we understand and know it. There's his disregard for climate change and his disregard for marginalized people in the states as well as people in areas and countries like Syria. And his Attorney General recently renewed the war on drugs, the bane of our existence in terms of trying to get criminal justice for all. He in his own crass and dangerous affirmation of police brutality, is doing something that will lead, if nothing, more likely than not, will lead to more killings of black men and women, not less. But perhaps the most disconcerting thing is his utter disregard for the rule of law and the U.S. Constitution, however imperfect that Constitution is. But thanks to the Constitution, which is still there, pretty much intact, the ACLU has been meeting Trump again and again in court. In Maryland, we've allied with our national office to go against Trump in his Muslim ban early on, against his more recent transgender service member ban, and against his refusal to hand over public information to public on the practices of his federal agencies. So we are indeed at a pivotal moment in history. And I think it's fair to ask, is President Trump a fascist? Is he an autocrat or a dictator? Is he a despot or a tyrant? Is he an authoritarian or a totalitarian? And if he's any of these, the next question becomes, what do we as the people do about that? And to answer those questions and more, we have some really interesting and illustrative a panel of experts. And I want to also thank all of you who are in this large crowd tonight. Every one of you makes a difference, and I'm so happy that you're interested enough in this very important topic to come tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Furman. Thank you, Susan. My name is Tom Hall. I'm the host of Midday on WYPR Radio. And by the way, today is the year anniversary since our team took over that show, Midday, and I very much appreciate any of you who listen occasionally and the rest of the folks who do tune in. We're having a really good time, and the response to the show has been great. So thank you all very much for your support of our show and public radio in general. Our question that we're posing for folks tonight is this what democracy looks like, protecting the republic in the age of Trump? So we're going to figure out tonight, at least partially, what it is we need protecting at the moment, what parts, what facets, what dimensions of the republic are in most dire need of being protected, and then further, how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? We will explore the crisis that democratic institutions and our government are facing throughout all levels of government, and we'll do so in the context of a president. And Susan talked a little bit about what this president has done, but there are some sort of basic facts and basic data that we all need to acknowledge. Number one, we have a president who fabricates stuff all the time. He just makes stuff up constantly. He demonizes groups of people by religion and ethnicity. He dismisses foreign intervention or interference in the electoral process as a witch hunt. He makes equivalencies between white supremacists and neo-Nazis and the people who are protesting against them. And he was elected, according to our Constitution, duly and completely. So he is the president, and 139 million Americans voted in the election. 60% of them voted for him. We can talk all we want about how 11 million people voted for someone other than him, but he is the president, and he is part and parcel of our democracy, and in fact, he's of course the head of it. But 58.6% of eligible voters turned out in 2012, and 60% of people who could have voted in 2016 did vote. That means that 40% of us did not. Here in Maryland, about 1.5 million registered voters did not participate in the election. So when we talk about Hillary's margin being 3 million, it could have been 4.5 million if you just added the people in Maryland who may have voted for her. And nationally, it could have been a whole lot more. So we'll think a little bit about that. The United States ranks 31 out of 35 countries in voter participation. Belgium, for example, votes at a rate of about 87% all of the time. And of course, this election in 2016 was the first election without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And that's, of course, a big dimension to consider as well. So we are going to get questions after each of our speakers makes a presentation, and we'll hear from each of them first. And then we're going to get questions, which I understand are going to be texted to me here on this computer. So we will, after our speakers have made their presentations, we'll have a dialogue, and I'll ask some questions of my own and incorporate questions that you have in the audience. If you don't have a cell phone, you can write your question down and give it to one of the ushers, and they'll make sure that it gets texted up to me or handed up to me so that we can have as much participation from everybody as possible. We're going to start this evening with Kenneth LEDFORD, who is sitting directly to my left. He's an associate professor of history and law at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. He practiced law for 4 years in Virginia before turning to the study of history. He joined the department at Case Western in 1991. He also teaches in the law school there. He is a scholar of European legal history, particularly German legal history. He's written many articles in a book called From General Estate to Special Interest, German Lawyers, 1878 to 1933. I bet that'll be an HBO special pretty soon. Last year, he was the John W. Klug Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He has a BA and a law degree from the University of North Carolina and a master's and PhD from right here in Johns Hopkins. Please welcome Kenneth LEDFORD.
To have been invited to be here. This is a city that's very familiar to me from my days of graduate study. Both of my children were born here, and my daughter spent a delightful summer here at MICA in its program for high school students. So I'm delighted to be on this platform. In my short presentation, and in our longer time together for questions, I want to emphasize 3 important issues. First, I want to spend some time talking about the problematic challenge to American conceptions of free speech by political ideologies dedicated to their own use of free speech to obtain power in order to end free speech for others. Second, I want to talk a little bit about what I view as the flawed nature of the deeply rooted American metaphor of the free market of ideas, which has been used to structure what I call a First Amendment absolutist view of free speech through the 20th and into the beginning of the 21st century. And third, I want to bring to bear a comparative example from the country whose history I study, namely Germany. A study of alternative systems that have been rooted in Germany's own troubled history in the 20th century, that guarantee robust and stinging free expression, but also prohibit expression that cultivates hate for minorities and undermines democracy for all. Now, since I received the invitation to speak here at MICA for Constitution Day, the onrush of events has made me rearrange my position on some of these issues. This past April, I spoke at a teach-in sponsored by the Social Justice Institute at my university, whose topic was 100 days into the Trump presidency, is this neo-fascism or something else? I took the position it was something else. I assured the gathered faculty, students, and community members that the current president is not ideologically consistent enough to be termed fascist, although he had surrounded himself with some advisors who are clearly fascists, and that many of his policies do the work of fascism. My message was that the situation is not good, especially for populations that are the targets of these policies. immigrants, the poor, people of color, even many of the president's own voters. But in my view, while this is a scoundrel time, it is something that can be weathered. And those not directly affected by the administration's harsh policies must join with those who are to resist those policies and to succor the target groups. Then came Charlottesville. As members of the ACLU clearly know, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th points out in sharp relief the tensions between free speech and its exercise by groups committed to intimidation and threats of violence, and whose hate-filled rhetoric inspires members of those groups even to commit murder. As to the political identification of those who participated in the Unite the Right rally, this photograph of James Alex Fields, the accused murderer of Heather Heyer, taken before his vehicle-borne terrorist attack, bears one of the insignia of the groups that sponsored the rally, Vanguard America, picturing what the press consistently called crossed axes. This is another of its symbols. But even a surface scrutiny of the shield and this axe reveals that this is not merely an axe, but it's an axe bundled in rods, which is a fasces, which is the symbol of fascists. Given this self-identification as a fascist by a follower of the alt-right, who then proved himself willing to use an ISIS tactic to murder counter-demonstrators exercising their own free speech rights, and given the repeated assertions by the current president that there were in Charlottesville, quote, some very fine people on both sides, close quote, I've had to re-examine my earlier conclusion about who should be should be termed a fascist. For here is what some of those very fine people looked like on August 11th and 12th. And I love the Confederate flag baseball bat. The president has absorbed immense domestic and international criticism from the press over this statement. Time, The New Yorker, and The Economist all resorted to cover art that was willing to go there. And I'm told that the New Yorker cover was drawn by a MICA faculty member. So you have participated in this. And if anything, the German press has been even harsher, as it was during the campaign and has been since the election. This is Der Spiegel. It says the true face of Donald Trump. And my favorite is Der Stern, which has a cover that is, we're going to come back to this, and it says his struggle, a reference clearly to Hitler's book Mein Kampf. And here is an inside illustration from that same issue of the Spiegel. But in the United States, debate about the ability of government to protect the targets of hate rallies and hate speech, like that at the Unite the Right rally, has been severely constrained by 20th and 21st century jurisprudence. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this as I would for a law school class, but suffice it to say that the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which protects speech, assembly, and petition for redress, was not very much ruled upon through the first 140 years of the Republic's existence. It came into jurisprudential effect really with the passage of the Espionage Act a century ago as part of the First World War. And those who dissented from the war-making goals of the American government were arrested and claimed that their speech was protected by the First Amendment. And after all, a number of individual cases, by 1929, the courts consistently accepted government infringement of free speech. Now, this was mostly free speech by socialists, anarchists, and communists. And this was continued after the 1940 Smith Act, which made it illegal to be a member of a party that called for the violent overthrow of the government, aimed only at communists, which was upheld in the Dennis case in 1951. In 1969, after a long struggle by organizations, particularly in the American Civil Liberties Union, in the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, incidentally a case in which an Ohio Ku Klux Klan leader had been prosecuted under the Ohio criminal syndicalism statute, only then was Whitney expressly overruled. Now, we've often regarded that this half-century of First Amendment jurisprudence broadening and absolutizing the freedom of expression, even for hateful and repugnant ideas, to be a natural and necessary part of a strong and vibrant democracy. Much of the justification for this laissez-faire First Amendment jurisprudence comes from the rhetorical invocation of the metaphor of the free market of ideas. Neoliberalism invokes the market metaphor as the best way to structure all institutions and relationships. And in the free expression realm, it means that the best remedy to bad free speech is more free speech, in the faith that good free speech will drive out bad free speech. But just as the events of 2008 have caused a re-examination of the blind faith that markets always function efficiently, as posited in introductory economics lecture courses, for me at least, the events of Charlottesville have caused a re-examination of the inheritance of First Amendment absolutism and faith in the free market of ideas. I want to suggest, in my last few minutes, another alternative for how free democracies can structure the relationship between freedom of expression and ideologies dedicated to ending democracy and free expression altogether. And that is to highlight the historical and comparative example of the Federal Republic of Germany since 1945. As has been brought home in just the past month, during which a Chinese tourist was arrested for posing on the steps of the Reichstag while giving the so-called German greeting, more commonly known as the Hitler salute. And in the same month, an American tourist, drunk and belligerent at 8 o'clock in the morning in the Central Plaza of Dresden, received a beating from an irate German when the tourist was making the same gesture. The Federal Republic of Germany imposes substantive limitations on certain kinds of free speech. Notice this guy is making the Hitler greeting in front of a riot policeman, and the riot policeman then acquaints him with the fact that this is illegal. While Article 5 of the Basic Law of the Federal Republic, which functions as Germany's constitution, while Article 5 robustly guarantees freedom of speech, it also permits limitation, both by other provisions of the Basic Law and by democratically enacted general laws. Certain of those restrictions on free expression find parallels in U.S. law, such as exceptions for insults to personal honor, which can find resolution in defamation actions instead of fistfights or duels. But most peculiar to American notions are, first, the ability under Article 21 to proscribe political parties that have been determined to seek to undermine or endanger the free democratic basic order. And second, the prohibition, under this, only two parties have been banned, a neo-Nazi party in 1952 and the Communist Party of Germany in 1956. And in fact, just this January, the Federal Constitutional Court refused for the second time to ban the current neo-Nazi party, the National Democratic Party. There's always one, and it's always seeking to be banned. Article 86A of the Criminal Code bans the depiction of symbols of political parties that seek to destroy democracy. Thus, you cannot make the Hitler salute, you can't show a swastika. This permits satirical use. This is a permitted symbol. This is a permitted symbol. There are court cases on all of these. German law has the concept of militant democracy. In German, this is streitbare Demokratie or wehrhafte Demokratie. Democracy that has an affirmative obligation to protect itself. And German political culture embraces this also in a public education institution. In 1952, the Federal Central Office for Civic Education was created. Each of the 16 states has a state central office. It's organized under the Federal Ministry of the Interior. It holds school pupil contests for civic education. It's overseen by a curatorium of elected members of parliament from all political parties, and it delivers reports such as this one, which is a study of radicalization of people into neo-Nazi and Salafist Muslim kinds of doctrines. Now, it may be easy to dismiss this comparison to Germany, this call for the United States to learn something from another country, as something that doesn't apply to our far different culture and history. But to return to First Amendment jurisprudence, I want to conclude with Justice Robert Jackson's 1949 dissent in a case called Terminiello versus Chicago. In that case, the Supreme Court overturned as a First Amendment violation the conviction of under a Chicago breach of the peace statute of an anti-Semitic right-wing priest whose speech at a public gathering had caused a riot. William Douglas wrote a 5-4 majority opinion saying you couldn't do this. You have to, the conviction was overturned. This is viewed as a victory for free speech. But Jackson wrote a dissent in this, and he famously wrote, "If this court does not temper its doctrinaire logic with a little practical wisdom, it will convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact." Now, Robert Jackson famously took a leave of absence from his position as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court from 1945 to 46 to serve as the chief U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials of major war criminals, and thus possessed a unique view of the relationship of free speech to fascism in the German context of the Weimar Republic. In Terminiello, he wrote that the choice was not between order and liberty, but between liberty with order and anarchy with neither. Jackson thus challenges us as Americans to look to parallels between the German experience and our own, a process the Germans call, you gotta love German. All together now, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Which means coming to grips with, coming to terms with, mastering the past. These legislative enactments in Germany are requirements for Germany to come to grips and master its Nazi past. We've never done that in the United States with our Confederate past. And that's why these symbols can exist as free-floating symbols unchallenged. And I think we need to think about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ken. Of course, we're going to hear from our next two speakers. You see the text number on the screen there. If you have a question that you have on your mind now, having heard Ken's remarks, go ahead and text that question in, and we'll try to work it into the act. Our next speaker is an internationally acclaimed artist who is sitting to Ken's left, Dred Scott. He works in a range of media, including performance, photography, installation, screen painting, and video. His works have been included in recent exhibitions at MoMA, at PS1, the Walker Arts Center, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Pori Art Museum in Finland, as well as on view in America is Hard to See. That's the Whitney Museum's inaugural exhibition in their new building. In 2012, the Brooklyn Academy of Music presented his performance Dred Scott Decision as part of their 30th anniversary Next Wave Festival. His sculptures have been installed at Logan Square in Philadelphia and Franconia Sculpture Park in Minnesota. His work is in the collection of the Whitney, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Akron Art Museum. In 1989, his art became the center of great controversy over its use of the American flag. He was a student at the School of Art Institute at Chicago at the time. No less an august body than the U.S. Senate banned him. He has been written about in many newspapers, magazines, and books. He's appeared on Oprah, The Today Show, and CBS This Morning to talk about his work and the controversies surrounding it. His work has been integrated into lots of academic curricula. He's a graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and he did further study at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Please welcome Dred Scott.
So thank you. It's cool to be at an art school. I got some art supporters out there. This is good. And actually, this is a very good panel to be on. I'm glad that we are actually being able to address whether or not Donald Trump is indeed a fascist and what we need to do about it. So there's not a lot of time, so I'm just going to kind of get into it. I'm a visual artist. I make revolutionary art to propel history forward. As it was said, I've been had my work outlawed by the Congress, and I've been denounced by George Bush, which I consider a great honor. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about my art tonight. I'm going to very quickly show 4 quick images to get a sense, for those of you who don't know my art, what it looks like, and then I'm going to move on to the broader talk that I want to talk. So this is an artwork called What's the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag? It was interactive. People could write responses to the question, what's the proper way to display a U.S. flag, as they interacted with the work. The photo montage, which is a little hard to see at this scale, I'm not showing in detail, has images of South Korean students burning U.S. flags, holding signs that say, Yankee, go home, son of a bitch, and flag-draped coffins coming back from Vietnam in a troop transport. This is Imagine a World Without America. And I'm not, again, just going quickly, so. This was an update on a flag that the NAACP used to fly over its national headquarters in New York whenever the day after anybody was lynched, and I updated it. And this references the fire hosing of civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, and elsewhere in the 60s. So my main point is that, that I want to talk about. I'm going to actually make 3 points. One, as introduction, is that Trump, as we kind of all know and we've been talking about a little bit, is attacking and eroding traditional ways that the ruling class in this country has ruled. He is a fascist, and it is a fascist regime. And I'm glad that, people grappling with this are thinking, well, really, is this true? And really looking and thinking, is this true? Because we shouldn't throw that term around lightly. It's not just a curse word. It actually has implications. If he's a fascist, what do we do about it? And beyond him, the Trump and Pence regime being fascist, it's significantly advanced its program over the short period that it's been in office. Refuse Fascism put out a statement that was run as a full-page ad in the New York Times sort of about a month before the inauguration. And it says, fascism, and this is just an excerpt from it, but I want to focus on this. Fascism foments and relies on xenophobic nationalism, racism, misogyny, and the aggressive reinstitution of oppressive, quote, traditional values, unquote. Fascism feeds on and encourages the threat and use of violence to build a movement and come to power. Fascism, once in power, essentially eliminates traditional democratic rights. And there were several signatories to this statement, but I think that this is kind of sort of sobering. So since then, Donald Trump and his administration has expressed tremendous contempt for the rule of law. He's attacked judges. He's pardoned Joe Arpaio, which one of the things that Arpaio did, he was held in contempt of court for violating the Constitution, and Trump says, I'm cool with that. Go ahead, brutalize your prisoners. Brutalize anybody, do racial profiling. That's what I'm supporting. He has suppressed dissent. Protesters from the initial inauguration protests are facing 70 years in jail. Most are only facing 20, but some are facing 70 years in jail for protesting the incoming president. He's demanded that an ESPN journalist, Jamel Hill, be fired. He's run over CNN with a train, at least metaphorically, and tweeted about that. And further suppressing dissent and criticism, he's attacked Saturday Night Live, one of the most well-known and respected TV shows comedy shows on air. He's attacked the play Hamilton for their criticism of Mike Pence when he was in the audience. He's been upset with Kelly Griffin's depiction of him sort of as being decapitated. Shortly after he appeared in Saudi Arabia, posing with people handing him a sword in a regime that executes people by decapitation. And he's criticized Meryl Streep. So these are all very beloved, respected artists. And so this is significant that the President of the United States is singling out not just artists like me, who's a visual artist that doesn't have several Academy Awards, but he's gone after some of the top respected cultural institutions. He, as was pointed out, has a movement of 21st century brown shirts. In Charlottesville, they came out with a public, and they weren't just carrying their tiki torches, and it wasn't just one lone nut that actually drove his car into people. They were saying, Jews will not replace us. They were saying, they were doing this. They were actually, it was a fascist brown shirt rally, and he wouldn't distance himself from that because he actually needs that fascist social base. Okay, Hitler was, the Nazi Party was democratically elected, but they also had a violent core that was out there actually beating people into submission before the election and after. And that's actually something Donald Trump needs and fascists need, and this is happening. Society is being increasingly militarized, including on the police level. And as we probably all know, cops in St. Louis were chanting, "Whose streets are streets?" after violently arresting people that were protesting the acquittal of a cop who shot somebody because they were black, basically. Trump is openly a racist. He's targeting black and Latino people in many ways, and the appointment of Jeff Sessions is actually just, and the reassertion of the war on drugs, is just one particular embodiment of that. He's advanced his program of xenophobic nationalism. The Muslim ban was the stay of the Muslim ban was upheld by the Supreme Court, including with the majority that he helped to implement, and he's threatened nuclear war and more, and he today just threatened he might have to eliminate, basically, bomb all of North Korea. He's expanded wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and he's unleashing despots to carry out wars in the Middle East. And his misogyny is just open and rampant and ongoing. His constant attacks on women, and that actually has a lot, his viewing of women has a lot to do with how at least fascist Germany related. And Mike Pence, just because it's not just Trump, he can't even be in the room with a woman unless it's his wife. He's on record of that. And then there's the war on science, which is a little different than how things happened in Germany, but it's actually very, very significant, the tremendous denial of science and rationality that this administration concentrates. This fascist regime is actually charging ahead, and it needs to be driven out. It's up to people in this audience and people like you to drive this regime out of power. So that's point one. Point two is that we actually need a revolution, okay? This is a country... We do. This is a country that was founded on slavery and genocide, and its constitution is an exploiter's vision of freedom. You get in just literally 4 paragraphs, and you're talking about giving disproportional voting rights in the federal government to states that enslave people. Okay? Slavery is at the heart of the U.S. Constitution. There would be no United States without slavery, and that's just a simple and basic truth. And beyond that, beyond its sort of the founding documents and conception of what the U.S. is, I've lived under U.S. democracy my whole life. It is a nightmare. There is no time when America was great. There is no greatness to return to. This is a democracy that serves capitalism. And to talk about democracy severed from the class nature that it serves is actually worse than meaningless. It does a disservice. Time is short, and I can't go into all of that. You know, it's like we only each have about 10 minutes. And so I'll look at just one aspect of what life in democracy under America is like. White supremacy. It's at the heart of America. Again, there would be no United States as we know it without slavery. If you look at every measurable indication of quality of life, from wealth to income to health to incarceration, black people are on the bottom end of that. We are getting the short end of the stick. I was happy to hear that we talked about Freddie Gray just as opening this up. I mean, a man was fine before he encountered the police. He had his neck snapped and he was driven around in the back of a police van until he died, and those people are not going to be put in jail for that crime. Michael Brown, another name that everybody in this room knows. Walter Scott, a man who, with good reason it shows, fled from a traffic stop when because he feared for his life. He was shot in the back, and then the policeman actually worked to cover that up. Beyond that, Trump is not the first white supremacist in the White House. In fact, it's actually part of the job description. I will say that I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, which got applause. I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of making voters of jurors of Negroes, nor qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of a superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position be assigned to the white race. It's Abraham Lincoln. It's like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is also terribly true. That's Woodrow Wilson talking about the first film that was shown in the White House, Birth of a Nation, a film that actually glorifies the Ku Klux Klan and shows black people as depraved savages out to rape white women. I could understand why white Southerners wanted to make sure their, quote, sweet little girls are not required to sit in a school alongside some big black buck, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And then there's Nixon and Reagan, whose policies were systematically around the war on drugs targeting black people, and Ehrlichman actually came out and said that's what the intent of the Nixon policies were. So this is, kind of what America is. Now I want to show a very brief clip, about a 3-minute clip of a video of a performance that I did called Dred Scott Decision, which actually talks a little bit about the Constitution, and then I'll wrap up after that. But this is a democracy that's rooted in slavery, and this is a quick excerpt, but I think you can get something from it.
The Dred Scott Decision, opinion of Chief Justice Taney. Transcript of Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857, December term, 1856. Dred Scott versus John F.A. Sanford. Dred Scott, plaintiff in error, v. John F.A. Sanford. Chapter 1. 1. Upon a writ of error to a circuit court of the United States, the transcript of the record of all proceedings in the case is brought before this court and is open to inspection and revision. 4. A free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. 5. When the Constitution was adopted, they were not regarded in any of the states as members of the community which constituted the state and were not numbered amongst its people or citizens. Consequently, the special rights and immunities guaranteed to citizens do not apply to them. And not being citizens within the meaning of the Constitution, they are not entitled to sue in that character in a court of the United States, or the circuit court has not jurisdiction in such a case. 6. The only two clauses in the Constitution which point to this race treat them as persons who it is morally lawful to deal in as articles of property and hold as slaves. 7. Since the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, no state can, by any subsequent law, make a foreigner or any other description of persons citizens of the United States, nor entitle them to the rights and privileges secured to that citizen by the instrument. 8. A state, by its laws, has...
So, the Trump and Pence regime is fascist. It is truly dangerous, and I'm really glad that we are talking about this. It needs to be driven out. We cannot wait until 2018 or 2020 or 2024. That is too late. Lives are being destroyed as we speak. And so, you know, these are very serious times when we are being asked a lot of ourselves and what we do with our lives. How will history judge us? I think it's important to drive out this regime for humanity, but not to return to November 7th, 2016, but to move forward to a country we'd actually want to live in. And so I will say that, no, I'm going to skip this. I didn't want to redo it. If you want to know a little bit more about my art, you can go to my website. But also, I'd encourage you to participate on November 4th in what RefuseFascism.org is organizing, that's stepped up efforts to drive this regime from power. It is that serious, and I think that, you know, while I hope we talk about a range of things, including the systemic nature of you know, what's being transformed, that the question is, what are we going to do about it? And RefuseFascism.org has a plan, and I hope you will be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dred. That's disconcerting and provocative, to say the least. So thank you very much. Again, the text number is on the screen, 443-692-7064, to submit questions after we hear from our third and final speaker, Joanne Reed. Joy Ann Reed, she is a political analyst for MSNBC and the host of AM Joy, which we all watch Saturdays and Sundays from 10 to noon. She's also the author of Fracture, Barack Obama, the Clintons, and the Racial Divide, which was published in 2015. And she's the co-editor with E.J. Dionne of We Are the Change We Seek, the speeches of Barack Obama. She's also a columnist at the Daily Beast, and she teaches a course for Syracuse University in New York City. Earlier, she was the managing editor of thegrio.com. She also was a freelance columnist for the Miami Herald and as an editor of the political blog The REID Report. She is a former talk radio producer and host for Radio 1, and she previously served as an online news editor for the NBC affiliate in Miramar, Florida. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Ms. Reed served as the Florida Deputy Communications Director for the 527 America Coming Together initiative, and she was a press aide in the final stretch of President Barack Obama's Florida campaign in 2008. She has written columns that have appeared in the New York Times, the Daily Beast, the New York Magazine, the Guardian, the Miami Herald, and many other publications. She graduated from Harvard University in 1991 with a concentration in film, and she is a 2003 Knight Center for Specialized Journalism Fellow. Please welcome Joy Ann Reed.
Okay, hello, MICA. So there's an ironclad rule in show business, which is never follow a law professor and a famous artist. I am breaking that rule right now. So wish me luck. I want to thank MICA for the invitation. Also, AJ, nothing but a number is a lie. I'm putting my glasses on. Thank you, MICA, for the invitation, Furman and Susan, and this great panel for being here. So some of what I say may reiterate some of what you've heard just in terms of the Trump administration. I'm going to turn my timer on so I don't go over time. But I'm reading currently the Hillary Clinton book, What Happened, and Hillary Clinton references FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt a lot. She has this connection, this sort of psychic connection that she feels to Eleanor Roosevelt. So in preparing to come here today, and I have no visual aid, sorry, you just have to look at me in my glasses. I was thinking a lot. I've been thinking myself a bit about FDR and the fact that in 1941, in his State of the Union address, and this, of course, after his election to his third term as president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he gave the famous speech which became known as the Four Freedoms speech. And he spoke of the four fundamental freedoms that people everywhere in the world, in his view, ought to be able to enjoy. Of course, those are freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now, FDR delivered that address to a nation that was reluctant to go to war. He delivered it as Europe was falling to the aggression of the Nazis and fascism was infecting our politics here at home. 4 years later, FDR's successor, Harry Truman, addressed the closing session of the United Nations Conference in San Francisco, where the UN Charter was signed on June 26, 1945. Now, Truman, in his speech, said the following, among other things, to the delegates who were assembled in San Francisco. He said, "Somewhere in this broad country, every one of you can find some of our citizens who are sons and daughters or descendants in some degree of your own native land. All our people are glad and proud that this historic meeting and its accomplishments have taken place in our country, and that includes the millions of loyal and patriotic Americans who stem from the countries represented at this conference." An interesting and sort of different take on immigration than what we have today, to say the least. Truman also spoke about our own U.S. Constitution, which of course we celebrated on Constitution Day this past Sunday. The very first UN General Assembly would be held the following year. So today we have a very different kind of president with a very different sense of the American story and the obligations of the United States to the world. Donald Trump, I don't know if any of you got a chance to watch him address the United Nations today. It was his second time addressing the UN this week. It was a prospect that I think filled a lot of Americans with a kind of existential dread, right? If you think of Donald Trump as more of an entertainment figure than a statesman, the idea of him on that world stage, it gave you a bit of agita. So his first speech that Donald Trump did at the UN, it was actually a subdued performance. Peter Baker and Soman Samgupta of the New York Times described it, saying that instead of a tiger, the UN got a tabby. Trump, the apostle of American first, who has heaped scorn on global institutions, ripped up international agreements, and quarreled even with allies, offered a subdued and largely friendly performance on the upcoming, on his vanguard visit to the United Nations. Well, that lasted for about a day. Because today Donald Trump addressed the UN General Assembly and was a very different Trump. The tabby was gone, to say the least. Donald Trump stood on that stage. He trashed the Iran nuclear deal. He called it an embarrassment to the United States. He referred to the dictator of North Korea, who's not the most stable character out there, Kim Jong-un, as Rocket Man, taking that directly out of his tweets and actually using that in a speech on the world stage. He said the U.S. may have to totally destroy North Korea if they don't stop pursuing nuclear weapons, which of course they already have. And in doing that, plus threatening to pull out of the Iran agreement, I'm not sure how that is supposed to motivate Kim Jong-un to feel confident making any kind of a deal and not becoming more aggressive. He talked about loser terrorists, high-minded speech from Donald Trump, and he praised China and Russia. It was quite a performance. If you didn't get to see it, check it out on YouTube. So clearly, the long-term prospects for Donald Trump versus the world are not so sanguine if you believe in an America that is a citizen of the world or that is a leader of it. Meanwhile, on the domestic front, as you've heard from our previous speakers, you might say that Donald Trump's presidency represents a kind of fundamental and existential threat to four freedoms that Americans have for a long time, perhaps too long, taken for granted. This is my version of these four freedoms, and I would say they are freedom to vote and to elect our own president free from foreign interference, freedom of the press to operate according to the First Amendment without intervention or intimidation from the White House, freedom to be in public spaces, whether you are white, black, brown, Asian, Muslim, or LGBT, and to be protected and not menaced by the police, and freedom from fear, to borrow from FDR, fear of your own government, including having to wonder whether your government is being operated for the personal financial benefit of a ruling family and their cronies and friends, while threatening to take away basic protections for you, like health care, clean air, clean water, and of course the right to vote. Donald Trump, who was elected with the help of a hostile foreign power, a power that's adversarial to the United States and hostile to our global interests, and who to this day refuses to even criticize that foreign power. In fact, he praised them yet again today, and who instead continually seems to align himself with the Russian aims and interests, has through his election shaken for a lot of Americans the very foundation of their confidence in the democratic process. Because if we can't trust that the election of the American president was actually affected by the voters themselves and not by the machinations of a foreign power, then democracy itself actually loses its saliency. It loses its firm foundation. So whether you like Donald Trump or not, I suspect not a lot of people here like him, whether you voted for him or not, Americans ought to at least know that we elected our own president. We ought to have the right to know and say with confidence that our voter rolls weren't tampered with by a foreign power, that people who went to go and vote were not prevented from voting because their names were subtracted by somebody far away in a distant country who was trying to manipulate the election for their own ends. We ought to be able to know that information was not injected into our social media universe by hostile foreign operatives who may or may not have operated with the cooperation of one of the two candidates for president. We ought to know that both political parties did everything in their power to protect the integrity of our election, that neither party was willing to wink and nod at foreign intervention just for the raw acquisition of power for themselves. But we don't know any of that 8 months into the Donald Trump administration. In fact, quite the opposite, Donald Trump has assembled an election integrity commission led by the Vice President, Mike Pence, that includes some of the country's most notorious practitioners of voter suppression. People like Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who, even though he wasn't from Arizona, authored Arizona's Papers, Please law. Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation, who last week was unmasked as the author of a memo that advocated that no Democrats and no mainstream Republicans be included on the commission lest they undermine its work of pushing for voter suppression laws. That commission has already met resistance from dozens of state officials who are refusing a request to turn over the private data, the private personal information of their citizens to the federal government. It's kind of ironic. This is a federal government that doesn't want to do anything in terms of gun control and giving out the information of people who want to buy an AK-47, but they want the private information of voters. And the commission has, according to most experts, been assembled for one reason only, and that is to make it harder for people of color and younger people, namely people who tend to vote Democratic, to vote. So freedom to vote and elect our own representatives, one of those four freedoms. Donald Trump has also taken an unprecedented stance toward a free press. He's used the presidential podium to attack individual journalists, including sicking his rally crowds on journalists like my colleague Katie Tur, who was singled out by name so that crowds could jeer at her, to the point where she needed Secret Service eyes on her at all times during his rallies. He's mockingly suggested that a black veteran reporter, my colleague April Ryan, ought to go set up a meeting between him and the Congressional Black Caucus, as if that's her job because she's black. The Justice Department is prosecuting journalists who recorded the protests against his inauguration. Some of those journalists are still facing jail time, as you heard earlier. His press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, daughter of Mike Huckabee, last week called on ESPN to fire Jemele Hill, as you heard earlier, for speaking out against Trump and calling him a white supremacist, despite the fact that when Donald Trump worked for the same company that I do, NBC Universal, and drew a paycheck from them on The Apprentice, called Barack Obama a racist and questioned the president's birth certificate. As the Los Angeles Times wrote in a landmark series of editorials in April, in Donald Trump's America, the mere act of reporting news unflattering to the president is held up as evidence of bias. Journalists are slandered as enemies of the people. So freedom of the press. Donald Trump, who as a young man used five deferments to evade the Vietnam draft, has announced that trans people are by their very nature unfit to serve in the United States military. His Justice Department has withdrawn from Obama-era programs that attempt to bring police and communities of color together, programs like the one enacted here in Baltimore. They're walking away from attempts for police to actually work with communities while re-ramping up the militarization of local police departments, ramping up civil asset forfeiture, and restarting federal contracts with private prisons. Trump has in word and Justice Department deeds signaled that the era of federal agreement with the idea, the really sort of basic idea that black lives do matter, and trying to reckon with centuries of police violence against black citizens is over. And the age of unleashing police on communities of color with the tacit support of the feds is back. And as you heard earlier, there are police actually marching and saying, whose streets are streets? And if you recall, during the campaign, there were police departments posing with Donald Trump wearing those MAGA hats. Imagine being a person of color pulled over by one of them. Would you feel safe in your car? Imagine being that white nurse in Utah who refused an illegal command to turn over the blood, the actual bodily fluids of a patient in her hospital, and then being violently arrested. Imagine being a protester in Charlottesville who watches a Klansman, an actual grand wizard of the Klan, fire a gun, fire live rounds into a crowd, and neo-Nazis beating up pastors, some of whom I interviewed on my program, with brass knuckles while police stood around and watched. Just this past week in St. Louis, again, we heard the whose streets, our streets, and we saw an elderly woman trampled by police who was then herself arrested and charged with a crime. So freedom to be in public spaces protected and not menaced by your own government. We also keep learning more and more about the self-dealing and self-enrichment by this president and his family, whether it's Jared globetrotting around the world looking for foreign investors to salvage 666 Fifth Avenue and seeming to punish countries like Qatar who refuse to go along, or Trump himself continuing to cut hotel deals around the country after his election, not to mention every single swipe at his hotels being an emolument directly into his pocket, whether at Mar-a-Lago, $200,000 a pop, and we don't know who the members are, or at his hotel that he leases in Washington in the old D.C. post office. Every time somebody swipes a card in the bar or checks into a room, the President of the United States is violating the emoluments clause openly, and nothing is happening. Nothing is being done. Not to mention the growing fear among many Americans that the neediest of presidents, the man who demands and craves the praise of the mainstream media, even as he attacks us, may seek that praise in the way that presidents almost unfailingly do with a military adventure in North Korea. So freedom from fear. Meanwhile, our president, through his crudeness, his rhetorical gravitation toward violence against women and people of color, his refusal to be bound by the historical and moral constraints of the presidency, has seemed to dampen four freedoms which seem especially designated, or have seemed, to champion four freedoms that he seems to have designated for a specific group of white Americans who've been frustrated by multiculturalism, by the browning of America, by the browning that produced 2 terms of Barack Obama, and by what those on the right call political correctness. Those 4 Trumpian freedoms seem to be freedom to express your worst, your most violent and hateful impulses, to let them out and let your freak flag fly at his rallies in guttural screams of lock her up, build the wall, and Trump that bitch, and worse. Freedom to discriminate against gay, lesbian, or trans people based on your Christian beliefs. Freedom to physically intimidate liberals and people of color, to march through the dark streets of Virginia carrying your citronella tiki torches and chanting "Jews will not replace us," and surrounding black and white parishioners inside a church to the point where one of the pastors inside of that church, Reverend Blackman, told me in a shaken voice after that rally that it reminded her of the Klan rallies that she used to hear in Alabama as a young girl. And freedom for police to be as violent or as deadly as they want to be against people who don't look like you without ever having to worry about the consequences, something that, by the way, endangers good police officers as well. So in these Trumpian freedoms, it is these Trumpian freedoms that he's advocating that do have 2/3 of the country on edge. Just this past weekend, as you heard earlier, Donald Trump was retweeting violent memes against Hillary Clinton, his Rocket Man foolishness against North Korea. He continues to go back and forth on DACA, leaving 800,000 people, and if you add their families, something like perhaps 3 million families on edge, wondering if they'll be deported. He's still fighting to ban Muslims from coming to this country, and his party is still trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So I don't want to go over my time, so I'll just very quickly say on the question of what do we do about it, because I am over time. And I will disagree with the previous panelist who says that we cannot wait until 2018. The reality of American democracy is that you have to wait. Elections have consequences, and when you don't vote, you vote. And this country allowed Donald Trump in. They knew what they were getting. He's been on TV for decades. And once you let him in, you're stuck with him. Maybe because my family, my parents come from countries where they were stuck with people like Donald Trump for decades, not 4 years. I understand that the only thing you can do to get rid of this, if you see it as a scourge on democracy, is that people have to exercise the one right that precedes all other rights. You have to vote. Donald Trump can be reined in by Congress. The Constitution gives Congress the power to rein him in. If Donald Trump's party controls both houses of Congress, he will not be reined in. He will be here until 2020, but for the grace of Bob Mueller. And so you've got to change. You have to change this seesaw trajectory that sees 60% of the country vote in presidential elections and 40% in midterms, particularly the withdrawal by people of color, by young people who stay away in droves in midterms, who don't believe that their votes count when literally 77,500 votes elected Donald Trump. So the only thing that I can advise you in terms of salvaging our democracy is that the courts are still working. Voting still works, but to counteract voter suppression, you have to overwhelm the other side with numbers. You have to vote like your life depends on it. Because for many people in this country, vulnerable communities, it actually does. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joy. That was terrific, and thanks to all three of you. How about a hand for all three of our speakers before we get into our questions? Thank you very much. So, Ken, let me go back to you. Taylor Branch, the great historian of the civil rights movement, writes in his King trilogy. A little smattering of applause for Taylor. That's good. All right. So far, we've got applause for Revolution, for Bob Mueller, and Taylor Branch. That's a pretty good thing. Taylor writes that terminology matters. He says some terms invite comfort and caricature rather than discovery. So, to what extent do you think progressives and people on the left are, in fact, just inviting comfort and caricature by putting a label of fascist on the president, and what does that say about our openness to the people who voted for Mr. Trump? If in fact we are going to come up with a democracy that is premised on compromise and some basic understanding of the other side.
I agree completely that terminology is really crucial, and terminology is always rooted in our own individual histories. One of the reasons for the transition that I described between late April and August for me is my own experience growing up in the Jim Crow South, growing up with the people who voted for Trump, being related to some of those people who voted for Trump. Happily not in my immediate family, but and also my experience in the student movement in the late 60s and early 70s, where I think fascist was thrown around far too freely. So I was very reluctant to go there with a man who, on one level, not only is a tiny-fingered vulgarian, but a bit of a clown. And the fact that we knew him from television really didn't impress me, partly because I never watched that crap, but partly because it's a show, it's an act. So I was very reluctant to call him a fascist. But when real fascists show up, and on the lawn at the University of Virginia attempt to reenact January 30th of 1933 through the Brandenburg Gate, while carrying fasces, and he then says, there's some fine people there. I think he has to be labeled with what he's asserted. My own personal experience in the United States, in living in this democracy, with all the white privilege that I've carried all my life, with all my male privilege that I've carried all my life, is that race is our unexamined, unmastered, uncome to grips with past. It's in the Constitution. It was stated by Roger Taney in just stunning terms in that decision. And the Trump voters, it is absolutely true they have economic problems, but I think those who say that's the explanation and we have to hide their racism are just avoiding the issue. I think they're racists.
And so, Dred, Taylor also writes in his biography of Dr. King that almost as color defines vision itself, race shapes the cultural eye. What we do and do not notice, the reach of empathy, and the alignment of response. So what Ken says is obviously quite true. But when it comes to this alignment of response, how do we respond now? You're calling for a revolution. What does that look like? Where does that begin? Is that a movement that is congeals around a person, a figure, a political leader on the left, or is it a kind of like the Black Lives Matter movement, which is much more diffuse and ground up? I mean, do you have a notion of what it looks like?
Okay, a simple question. We can solve this in 2 or 3 minutes. Well, I mean, I'll say, look, a revolution, people mean lots of different things by that. And I will say very briefly what I mean, but I actually don't think that getting into a long conversation about revolution, what kind of revolution, what does Dred think, what do others think, is actually going to be the most productive. But I will briefly say, I'm a communist, and I don't think let's move back to the Soviet Union in 1930. I do think that we actually do need a revolution to get rid of capitalism. Capitalism is a nightmare. It is crushing the lives of millions and billions of people. It is, it has led to world wars. It has led to famines. I mean, half the planet tries to survive on less than $2 a day. And I think in very basic terms, Marx's notion of trying to get to a world of freely associating human beings without exploitation and oppression, there's a lot to that. Then, what kind of leaders, what sort of leadership, what sort of revolution? I would encourage people to look at the work of Bob Avakian, who's the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party. He's done a lot of thinking about both past socialist societies, but broader sweep of human history, and has both made substantive criticism of how past revolutionary societies have steered away from what would actually get to a classless world, and caused great harm and great errors. But as I said, I don't think that the main thing we should talk about is that. I do think the question of what do we do now, what do we confront, you know, your point about the 60s, I think part of that matters. I mean, and how do you look at these, you know, growing up in the Jim Crow South, people didn't vote Jim Crow away. That was youth getting on buses and saying, we're going down to the Deep South and we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And they could have been, you know, the first bus of Freedom Riders, they could have been beaten to death or beaten badly, and nobody could have cared. That could have been the other outcome. As it turns out, it was a pivotal moment that sparked or transitioned that phase of the civil rights movement to where it actually gained a lot of strength, and people kept coming and coming and coming. I think that you know, people really need to, I'm not calling for a repeat of the civil rights movement, but I do think that actually change happens from below. It's millions of people saying, no, we're not going to take this anymore, and finding the correct ways that correspond to their time to act. And I think right now it's actually complicated. But I do think that you know, the question about, do we have to just tolerate Trump for 2 or 4 or 8 or 12 or 40 more years? The South Koreans recently drove out a despot that was running their country by weekly demonstrations that were sort of like Tahrir Square. Tahrir Square drove out another despot. I think that history judged the Germans quite harshly for not actually driving out Hitler, for not saying, look, it was democratically elected, we'll just wait until, but they said people in Germany should have driven Hitler from power or tried to. They didn't. And I think we are faced with that choice of whether we say, well, this is our system, elections have consequences, or do we say, not acting when we know what this is and what fascism does. And in this case, when a fascist has his finger on the nuclear button, history will judge us by standing on formal democracy.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
So, only because my 2015 book is still fresh in my mind, when people think about the 1960s, they tend to think about the demonstrations and not about the politics, right? So King and the Kingian movement and SNCC, who were the kids, the John Lewis kids, they weren't out there just getting their asses kicked just for the hell of it, right? They were only willing to get their asses kicked on television. If there were television cameras to watch them, so that they could beam those images to the little old lady sitting in suburban Chicago, so that she would be so disgusted that she might actually encourage her congressperson to vote for the Civil Rights Bill. And while they were getting their behinds beat, there were members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference who were on the phone with the White House and who were making sure that the White House steered the bill that was going through the Congress, through a Congress that happened to have 2/3 Democrats in the Senate, and that had it not had 2/3 Democrats in the Senate, could not have afforded to lose the 19 Southern senators and pass the bill. You know, LBJ, who grew up racist in Texas and who realized after Kennedy's death, and remember, Kennedy originally had the bill. The Civil Rights Bill was his bill, but he was not prioritizing it because he had a big tax cut he wanted to do. The March on Washington was not a march to demonstrate to the country that black people wanted to be free. Everybody knew that. It was a march to push Kennedy to get on with the bill because he was taking too long to get it done, right? So these things all had to do and all led back to politics. And the reality is that had the civil rights movement done the marches and not gotten the bills, it would have been judged by history to be a failure. So I think we have to remember that activism is not separate from politics. It pushes politics. The reason that the activism today of things like the Women's March and all of the Call Your Congressman movements that are being driven by social media, the reason they're working is not just because people are on Twitter, it's because Congress people are getting flooded with phone calls, and it freaks them out. If you've ever known a politician, the thing they hate is getting calls and emails. It freaks them completely out. And when they start getting 100 even, or 200 or 1,000, they change their minds. There's a reason why you have Murkowski and Susan Collins refusing to get on that bill to take away your health care, because they're worried about the calls. The reason McCain wavers is because he's worried about his constituency back home. Politics still works. And I think that we have to not shy away from using the political mechanisms that, while built by flawed and in some cases terrible men, still works. It's the architecture is actually still there. So I would urge people to realize, first of all, that, and maybe it's just the African in me, that says this idea that Americans say, we can't stand it for 18 months. Well, for Christ's sakes, speaks. People where my dad lives stood it for 40 years. Black people in this country stood it for 400 years. Oh, you can stand it. Black people put up with it for 400 and something years. You can stand it for 18 months. And you can start registering voters and preparing yourself to actually get people off their couches to vote in a midterm. Preparing is not doing nothing. Ramping up democracy is not doing nothing. So I think we have to remember that. And on the second point, we're not going to divert into another conversation, but I was in Cuba in February. We don't want that system, in my view. We just disagree on this.
I don't want that system.
We don't want that system.
I don't want Cuba either.
Yeah.
So we don't disagree.
Yeah.
Well, then, is it, Joy, then a matter of sort of shock and awe? In other words, does the left need to overwhelm the right, take over Congress, take over the Senate, and then in 2020 win the presidency? Or is it a matter that there can be at least a little more parity and more room for negotiation, compromise, discussion? I mean, look what Nancy Pelosi put up with yesterday when she went to San Francisco, and she was screamed down by the left.
That's right.
Saying, how dare you talk to this fascist autocrat we have in the White House about DACA? We will not be bargaining chips. So there are young people very concerned about the occurrence of a conversation in which Pelosi and Schumer thought they came out with something that was good. I mean, making lemonade out of some really rotten lemons.
Yeah, no, I mean, my friend Reverend Al Sharpton, my big brother, Reverend Al Sharpton once said to me that, Barack Obama can't march against himself, right? He's the president, he's not a member of the civil rights movement. So when Barack Obama did DACA, he did it because those same kids were demanding that he do it, or else. He was afraid, the administration was forced into DACA and pushed into it. He may have had the belief in doing it, but to force the conversation about, allowing LGBT people to serve open in the military, that activism pushes politicians to go where even sometimes they want to go, but don't necessarily feel like they have the sort of political strength to go. I think that, I'm thinking of a good friend of mine who was a pastor who said to me that when Dr. King was working in the movement and was sitting in that Birmingham jail, he was told by a pastor friend of his, the other side isn't trying to convert you, they're trying to defeat you. You can't convert the other side, you need to defeat them. Right? So I'm not a conversion politics person. I think that what you do is win the election and then negotiate from a position of strength. That's what Republicans are very good at. Win the election and then negotiate from a position of strength. Democrats keep trying to negotiate their way to an easy peace or even a cold peace with Republicans. Republicans aren't looking for peace. They're looking to dominate and control this country, absolutely, to get rid of health care, to privatize Medicare. These are the things Paul Ryan has wanted to do since he was in college doing beer pong. He really wants to do them, and they are not going to negotiate with Democrats. They won't even let Democrats in the room. So I think what Democrats need to think about is if you want to rein in Donald Trump, if that's your goal, you better win a House of Congress. You better win one, otherwise all you're doing is just talking among yourselves.
We have a... We have a question. Isn't it a matter of both strategies? Isn't the factionalism between socialism and the traditional left weakening our fight? We have now Bernie Sanders, pushing a bill, proposing a bill at this moment before the September 30th deadline that he's been pushing since he entered Congress, for Medicare for all. He talked about it in the campaign. But now we've had Lindsey Graham saying if you don't pass Graham-Cassidy, you're going to end up with Medicare for all. I mean, in terms of a strategy here and what the Democrats should be doing, what do you think?
Bernie Sanders is no more a democratic socialist than Joyanne Reid is. He is a New Deal liberal in significant ways. I agree with Dredd here that in terms of the American political spectrum, among elected politicians, there is hardly any significant left. Part of the reason Sanders stays an independent is it's a vestigial critique of Clintonian third way kind of stuff. The Republicans have made Barack Obama out to be some extreme left-wing president, and the first vote I ever cast for president was in the Democratic primary in North Carolina in 1972, which I'm sad to admit was won by George Wallace. protest when Terry Sanford, as a favorite son candidate, was unable to block him. But I didn't waste my vote because I voted for a person whom I still admire tremendously. She's passed away, Shirley Chisholm. The first presidential vote I ever cast was for Shirley Chisholm. Now, she was a leftist. And she would put Bernie Sanders to shame. So I don't think the conversation. You can talk about strategies, but this is MSNBC stuff. It's not revolution stuff. And I think we need to take that longer view. In German history, there's this trope that the Nazis came to power legally. That's a load. That is just wrong. Because constitutional rules stopped in 1930 when Hindenburg dissolved the connection between policy and the elected parliament and had these parliaments of experts. In the United States, I think you can argue that constitutional rule ended in December of 2000 with Bush v. Gore. And we've been trying to deal with this post-constitutional kind of period. And you talk about the emphasis of politics, and I agree. I think politics are really important. But politics are different from elections. And I think elections get stolen. I live in a tremendously gerrymandered state.
So do we.
I live, yeah, but you've got gerrymanderers I tend to agree with more than the gerrymanderers in my state.
2 words. Andy Harris. Okay, I'm sorry.
Ohio is 50-50, and our congressional delegation is 12 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Excuse me, the other way around, 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And the election's just not fair, and that's before you get to voter suppression, which I've seen consistently because it was really pronounced in 2000. Yeah. So in addition to flat stealing it with an unprincipled Supreme Court decision, the closeness was created by voter suppression. And then there's the Russians. And then there's the Russians, and we don't know exactly what that's done.
But can we also...
So I'm very skeptical about the power of elections to change things.
Except that Democrats in 2010,
they messed up.
You had in Michigan, for instance, where you have the Flint water crisis, where they still don't have clean water 2.5 years later. In 2008, Michigan voted at something like 62% turnout. 2010 comes around, it drops to 42% turnout.
Midterm, right.
It then whips back up again in the next presidential to close to 60, and then falls again to 40. That 2010 midterm was political malpractice. It was the Armageddon situation. It was a census year. And so Democrats withdrawing from the process gave Republicans the power to gerrymander purple states. They normally would gerrymander Mississippi. They now got to gerrymander Pennsylvania. They got to gerrymander Wisconsin, which is supposed to be a state Democrats can win. They got to change the voting laws in Wisconsin. Michigan, they got to withdraw Michigan, one of the original Union states, and they got to turn it right to work. Democrats let them do that. Democrats did not vote in the 2010 midterms, handed a half a dozen purple states to the people who then gerrymandered themselves into guaranteed power until 2020. 2020, you think that was Armageddon? 2020 is double Armageddon because it's a census year and a presidential. Now, for Republicans, that's supposed to be scary, but they've locked in gerrymandering at the state and federal level because of the withdrawal of Democratic voters. What the Democratic Party needs to do is to figure out how to convince the Democratic base that it's worthwhile to vote for something other than president. We've looked to the president and the presidency as the savior of people of color and poor people, particularly since the 1960s. We put our faith in that president because we said the cavalry that's coming is Kennedy's cavalry or LBJ's cavalry or even Eisenhower's. There ain't no cavalry now. It's Trump. It's Jeff Sessions that's running the Justice Department. If you're out there protesting, there is no cavalry. If the feds come, they're going to be worse than the police. So the reality is Democrats Democrats still have to use the process that's available because 2010 didn't have to happen that way.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think that as long as we're locked into it's got to be Republican or Democrat, Republican or Democrat. Let's figure out purple states. Let's figure out gerrymandering. We aren't actually talking about the real issues that are killing people and actually getting free of it. This is the problem. I think that you know, the fact that left can be, as you pointed out, can be between the radical edge of, you know, Bernie Sanders or maybe Barack Obama. Barack Obama on some policies was to the right of Reagan. Okay? So this thing of, I mean, if any system that we happen to be living under, we have to figure out how to make it work, that's a recipe for death. I mean, first off, just on voting, how many of you guys would vote in a segregated election if one were opened up to you? Well, nobody's raising their hand. Well, up until, you know, 1964, you had to if you were able to even vote. And so if that was going to be the mechanism through which things were going to change, you couldn't do it that way. People used other means to change things, and they have in a range of ways, from, you know, protesting in the streets, including working within democracies, to actually overthrowing systems and overturning them. And I actually, you know, strategically, that's what I'm about. But I think more than that, if we actually limit the conversation right now to how are we going to figure out how to, like, undo some gerrymandering and figure out which, like, Democrat we might be able to rely on to be a little bit more progressive, we are dead. They are killing people. This notion that we can't even have a conversation about, you know, and it gets ridiculed of whether we should look at 2018 or whether we should actually say we need to drive this regime from power. Is it fascist? If it is fascist, if it is actually fascist, and I think two of us say that it is, and one of us, I think, thinks that perhaps, maybe, I don't know, is it really responsible to say, well, okay, we can sit around and see where this goes? We know that they're actually rigging the elections, whether it's with the Russians or whether it's through gerrymandering or whether it's through voter suppression. We know that. And so the point is, to say that we should play on those terms as opposed to actually do other things, to get outside of the politics as normal, where we actually have a chance to discuss what our deepest interests are and figure out a strategy to get rid of a system that has never, ever for once met the great needs of the great interests of humanity, and actually has somebody in power now who's openly gets up before the United Nations and says he wants to destroy a whole country because they might have nuclear weapons, when he has the biggest stockpile on the planet and is the only country that's dropped them on civilian populations. It is morally bankrupt to actually tolerate that.
Except my rebuttal to that will be, if you go and you look at the history of what they call the American century, the 20th century, the New Deal, accomplished with a 2/3 Democratic Congress, would not have been accomplished had Republicans run that Congress, because they opposed the New Deal. The creation of Social Security, created by a 2/3 Democratic Congress. The integration of the military, accomplished by a Democratic president. If you want to go fast forward to the Civil Rights Bill, the Immigration Act of 1965, which added millions of Americans from countries that were not Europe to the body politic of the country, one of the most sweeping changes because it reversed the 1924 Racist Immigration Act, a Democratic Congress, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, 2/3 Democratic Congress. It's not all about parties, but our system is built to essentially accommodate two political parties. And one of those political parties, at least since the 20th century, has been the party of people of color. Has been the party of women. Well, white women don't vote for Democrats on balance. Most white women vote Republican for a lot of different reasons. But on balance, if you are part of an oppressed minority, if you are black or brown or Asian American in this country, one party has spent the last 100 and something years doing policy that on balance helps you. If you are elderly, you're not poor in your old age because of one party and the policies that keep your dotage from being in the streets hungry are opposed by the other party. The two parties are not they're not the same. They're not similar. They may be different degrees of left and right, but the Republicans have a very specific ideology. They're a 90% white party. That's just the way it's fallen out. And the Democrats are a party that relies for its votes on people of color. Black people are the most pragmatic voters in the country. They've never been able to rely on ideas, you know, outside of the system because this is the system we're in. And I think that you can't ignore the differences between the parties and the power of electing your preferred party to power.
But
you just
can't. Up until the 1960s, the Democrats were called the Dixiecrats.
A part of them were the Dixiecrats, and they were driven out because of the Civil Rights Bill. Now they're Republicans.
They became Republicans.
I would actually truncate your history by half. The revolution, I think, the party transition was about half a century ago.
Absolutely.
Because the first New Deal passed with Southern senators, excluded black people. Consciously, intentionally. And Ira Katznelson has written really well about that. You know, again, in North Carolina, Jesse Helms was a Democrat.
That's right.
Until he switched parties because there were too many black people coming into the Democratic Party. That's what Nixon started.
Strom Thurmond,
Ronald
Cornyn,
Reagan completed by starting his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Absolutely.
50 years is not long.
Nope.
And it has taken them this long to perfect it. And they failed in 2000, to their shock, to hold an office that they believed they had permanent right to, and then they resorted to what I am persuaded is as unprincipled a decision as the Dred Scott decision was in Bush v. Gore, where 5 people chose the president.
Agreed.
And the press accepted it.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
Looking forward, your friend Joy E.J. Dion has a new book with Norm Ornstein. They point out that in 2050, 70% of Americans will live in 30 states. Right? That means that 30% of Americans will have 40 senators.
That's right.
You know, so forget that, you know, the other arguments that the Republicans, you know, are putatively nervous about the browning of the electorate, and, you know, the fact that they're doing so terribly with people of color, people, Hispanic constituencies, etc. There is baked into this system, into the constitutional system, is this thing where people in Montana and Wyoming, you know, have as much power as people in California and New York,
or more,
more proportionally. So how do we address that?
Yeah, I mean, Hillary Clinton won, I think, what, 560 or 500 and something counties, and Donald Trump won like 2,600 counties in the country. Hillary Clinton's her counties control 64%
of the economy.
64% of the gross domestic product. I will say that again. The 500 counties won by Hillary Clinton produce 2/3 of the economic output of this country, whereas Donald Trump's 26 some odd hundred counties produce just 1/3. Congress right now is an exercise in sort of a repeat of what the Electoral College is. It so advantages rural red states over urban states that you can almost speak of the divide in the country as much as the racial divide as the urban-rural divide.
But
states with almost no population. No, it is. No, it is. It was built to be, right. So we know that the Electoral
College that replicates
exactly.
race.
And so the Electoral College system essentially was created to advantage slave states over free states, right? And we still are operating in that system that both in terms of your congressional and Senate representation all the way down, these red, rural, very white states control everything. They have much more representation. They have super representation, and gerrymandering locks that in. So long term, Republicans are engineering what will be minority rule. By 2044, it's estimated, will be a majority-minority country, but the minority will control the vast majority of the wealth and will still have the most representation in Congress. That is a crisis, and we do need to do something about it. The Electoral College is an abomination that shouldn't exist. And gerrymandering is locking it in as well, and that's something that and you know, let me not stand here and say that the Democrats are some sort of perfect party. I hope that's not what's come across. They are incredibly flawed. They've done some cynical games on race, even in the 90s, in order to try to win back white working class voters. But on balance, you have to pick one. You have Republicans and you have Democrats. That is the two options that you have before you in terms of your congressional and presidential representation.
So in Germany, in Germany in 1933 or 34, should people have just said, well, that's who's in office, we should just go with that until they decide to abdicate?
No, absolutely not. These are not arguments against each other. You know, the idea that the people of the United States, I'm not sure what you're advocating that they do. Do you want them to storm the Capitol and overthrow the government? I don't understand what you're advocating.
That'd be cool, but that's actually not what I'm saying right now.
I mean, there's the therapeutic dimension of this and the strategic dimension of this. You know, perfect being the enemy of the good. I mean, again, you know. Minority Leader Pelosi, you know, taking flack from people on the left in San Francisco for trying to fix this hideous situation with DACA. I mean, at some point, you know, is it unrealistic to think, and does it matter if it's unrealistic even, to think that, you know, the kind of major topsy-turvy change you're talking about is unlikely?
Well, I think that it's unlikely to, I mean, I think it's profoundly unrealistic to think that this system as it's constructed, and pick any year, I'm not just talking today, but can actually meet the interests and the needs of the great majority of humanity. Okay, and I think that right now it's unrealistic to think that trying to conciliate and work with fascists and try and figure out how we can actually make this work is going to do anything other than strengthen fascism. And again, I come back to, if this is fascist, is it something we should just say, well, look, we have to pick one party or the other? I don't think that's actually real. I do think that it is real to say the largest demonstration that happened in the history of the United States was the day after this president was elected. There are millions and millions of people, mostly women, who are out in the street saying this does not represent us. And I do think that in looking from Tahrir Square, I do think it would be a very good thing if there were occupations that actually said, we are not going home until this whole regime is gone, which is not the same as revolution, but I do think that actually regimes in various parts of the world have been driven from power. And that's not the conversation that some of us are actually wanting to have. Others of us, me, but I think a lot of people in society, and I suspect some people in this audience say, well, yeah, what could we do that we don't have to try and play by this system's rules, which ever since it's been constructed has actually oppressed and exploited us, and figured out way after way after way to continue to do that and find a way to continue to oppress people. And I think it's unrealistic to actually hope that we can somehow make this system, I mean, even if you know, take back Congress or something like that, I mean, that is still having all the changes which have been made and then only being able to restrain them a little bit is actually not what we should want. We should actually want to move to a society that reflects our values, and this one does not.
But if 77,600 of those women who went to the Women's March had turned out to vote for Hillary Clinton in 3 states, we wouldn't have a president that was calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and threatening to nuke him, right? I mean, you would have had a president...
The margin was razor thin.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you'd have Hillary Clinton as president if a lot... I mean, if you break down the women's vote, 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Okay, 94% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton, and something like 7 out of 10 Latino women voted for Hillary Clinton. So when I saw that Women's March, I thought, that's great. You're marching the day after he's already in. He's already in. You were out there, and I thought it was wonderful. We covered it. We watched the Women's March from D.C., but you know what? He was inaugurated yesterday. So you being out here is great. You're demonstrating a lot of verve, but the reality is if 77,600 of y'all had voted for Hillary Clinton, he wouldn't be there. It's just reality. You can't withdraw from the system and then say that you need to overturn the system. I mean, voting is the way that you overturn a regime that you don't like. Mm-hmm. It just is.
So you say. But that's not what I say.
In this country.
Well, okay, so then I guess we should just pack up and go vote. And what do we have? Wait, we've got Donald Trump in office. We've got people who voted. And this system is actually crushing people right now. It crushed people before, and I think if you actually want to just ridicule and say the only example, the only thing we can do is vote, and then blame people who didn't vote for why we have what we have, you're actually completely dismissing the argument of how...
I do actually blame people who refused. I mean, it's a difference between people who were disenfranchised and the 300,000 people in Wisconsin who showed up to vote and they didn't have the proper ID, or this cross-check program where maybe 1 million people were withdrawn out of the voting rolls. If anyone was Gonzalez, suddenly you were considered a double voter, and Chris Kobach's system stripped you. We're now finding out that Russian operatives may have interfered with the actual voting rolls in we don't know how many states, and literally deleted people off the voting rolls. The easiest way to disenfranchise people, you don't have to fix the machines, you don't have to flip the machines, you just take people off the rolls.
And if that was done, them and have to give them a felony conviction.
Exactly. Right. So if you think about the people who were kept from the voting rolls, that's in one bucket. In the other bucket are people who said, you know what, I just refuse. I don't like these 2 choices. They aren't good enough for me. I ain't voting for either one. Well, okay, but you got Donald Trump.
So what you're saying is his vote for Shirley Chisholm was an immoral vote, and he should have just picked...
Absolutely not. My first vote ever was for Jesse Jackson in 1988 in that primary. I don't think it was a wasted vote. I was voting my conscience. But hold on. When it came down to Jesse Jackson not getting the nomination, I had to pull that lever for Dukakis. I wasn't in love with Michael Dukakis. I didn't think he was the greatest person ever, but I knew he wasn't George Herbert Walker Bush, and that I would prefer the policies of Dukakis and the Democrats than I would to the policies of George Herbert Walker Bush. And I think if you were in Iraq for that first Gulf War, where we went in to try to do the bidding of Kuwait and fight for their oil, I think you might have probably preferred Michael Dukakis be president than George Herbert Walker Bush on balance.
Okay, so then I think we're going to disagree on some of this, but I do think...
You think?
I think it's conceivable, but I do think... So, okay, it's 2017 right now, and it's a long time before November 2018. Are you saying that the key thing that people should do right now is just worry about Congress in 2018, or should people be out actually protesting and organizing in other ways? With the equivalent of what, if people find the equivalent of the Freedom Riders and actually go and frankly break the law. Freedom Riders were breaking the law. Lots of other civil rights people were breaking the law. They weren't trying to figure out how we can actually call up our Congress.
But is it not, it's not an either or thing.
Not.
Dr. King had one foot in the pulpit and one foot in the street.
I never said it was over.
And he gave Johnson the cover he needed because he had the street.
You talking about let's figure out how to organize demonstration. I'm going to be out with you and refuse fascism on November 4th. I don't hear that. What I hear is we have to figure out how to make the voting thing work in 2018. So if you actually are saying, yeah, I'm going to turn over time on my show to have refusing fascism activists come on the show and talk about why we need to be out in the streets and build pressure that way, then fine, we agree that's cool. But I don't think that's what I'm hearing.
Well, actually, we have protest movements on our show all the time. I'm a journalist, so I don't lead marches.
That particular one.
Okay, we can talk about your time another time. We can negotiate that. I'll get my booking producer on the phone with you. But the point is that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, when they were pulled over in Neshoba County in Mississippi, they were coming from investigating the bombing of a church fire. You know what was going on in that church? Voter registration. They were killed because they were registering people to vote. Medgar Evers, who had the same job in Mississippi that Vernon Jordan had in Georgia, and they were very close friends. Medgar Evers was killed registering people to vote. He wasn't out protesting just the fact of oppression. He was protesting for the affirmative right to vote. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was getting their behinds beaten and their heads busted open, attempting to acquire for African Americans the right to vote. John Lewis had that contusion in his head, attempting to march for the right to vote. They were marching to Montgomery to demand the right to vote. King said that the way that you change the country is that you cannot change the hearts of the hateful sheriff. You cannot make him love black people, but you can damn well change the sheriff. Now, he didn't say damn well because he was a pastor, but you said you can change the sheriff. So that for the for the African American protester in the 1960s, the idea wasn't to acquire the love of white people. It wasn't the idea to acquire the affection of white people. It was the idea to acquire the outrage, enough outrage among white people so that you could acquire the right to choose which sheriff was going to police you, which judge was going to be in charge of you, which mayor was going to set the rules in your state, which governor was going to set the rules in your state, to get rid of the George Wallaces, or at least to scare them into changing, which is what happened to George Wallace. The idea is that all of those protests had at their core the right to vote. Give us the ballot is what was the
some of those
demand.
did, not all of them. Not all of the people
in the civil rights movement, 70% of the public disagreed with Dr. King's civil rights demonstrations. They thought the March on Washington was a bad idea. They thought that all of the demonstrations and the acts of civil disobedience were a bad idea. And a good bit of the violence happened after the March on Washington. It happened after the I Have a Dream speech. The kids in Birmingham in that church were killed 2 weeks after the March on Washington. After, not before. So, you know, if in fact the political action and voting and exercising that precious right isn't combined with being on the streets, then Dr. King wouldn't have gotten the Voting Rights Act. He would have gotten the Civil Rights Act.
Right after the March on Washington, the Big Six, King and the other members of the Big Six, went into the White House and met with JFK. They followed that action with a meeting in which they made demands. And I think that it's important that you have both components. I'm not saying it's either or. I think that you have to have the pressure because, as I said, it scares the hell out of politicians to see those people in the streets. Nixon was terrified by those protests. He didn't want that protest against the Vietnam War outside of his door. But the protest married to politics is what gave the civil rights movement power.
When we talk about protesting on the right, and we talk about protesting like the people who organize themselves, Unite the Right in Charlottesville. Ken, here's a question from someone in the audience. Why should we advocate for giving government the power to limit free speech when we know that the current government will use that power against the left?
This is the classic ACLU kind of argument, and that is and that is very powerful in the American context. It's very powerful in the German context as well. The key is to link it to an effective educational scheme to come to grips with your past. It is to create a consensus, which we have had at times in the United States, and which Germany has because it has come to grips with this enormity in its past. Now, it may be in the United States that the enormity of slavery and the Confederacy can be constructed as too distant. What does that have to do with me? But I once lived in Richmond, Virginia on Stewart Avenue, and we know which Stewart that was named after, and it's a block off of Monument Avenue. And that starts with Robert E. Lee, and it ends, strangely, with Arthur Ashe as a 1996 edition. But you can't
make this stuff up.
You can't make this stuff up. You can learn why Robert E. Lee is there, and it had nothing to do with Robert E. Lee. And it was years after Robert E. Lee was dead. And it was years after Robert E. Lee said no memorials. There has to be civic agreement. I am a historian, so I get to analyze these things retrospectively. I think it's worth opening a civic discussion about.
Joy, let me ask you this question. I get this question all the time from people on the left, and this comes from someone in the audience. So were people supposed to, as many put it, vote for the lesser of two evils and put Hillary, who called young black people super predators and at one time supported the progression of mass incarceration, in office? Is that much better than not voting at all?
Yes, it is. Unequivocally, yes, it is. I was at the Schomburg Center when Hillary Clinton gave a speech that was more forthright on the legacy of racism than I've heard a politician really do. She found herself in a position, particularly after the 2008 election, where she was on the other side of that racial question and that sort of caustic racial debate, where she had to either run toward Barack Obama's legacy or toward the Bill Clinton legacy. And she chose the Barack Obama legacy. She traveled with the mothers of the movement. She said some very blunt things about white privilege. She was pushed to do that because she understood that her politics meant she needed a robust turnout among African Americans, and she was trying to work toward that with the black community. That's called politics. That's politics working on her. Hillary Clinton has been in both camps. She's been a very conservative teenager, a Goldwater girl. She's been a very liberal advocate for children. She's been sort of all over the map. Saying that her comments in the 90s are a reason that she's just as bad as Donald Trump, when Donald Trump today is saying that neo-Nazi marchers contain good people. That is 30-something years ago. She made one mistaken comment. So you're telling me that because she said that stupid thing, that she's just as bad as this? That this, what we're dealing with, would be no different if Hillary Clinton, the multilateralist, the person who said Black Lives Matter, you're telling me she'd be just as bad? I say balderdash to that. So there is no way that she's the same. And so, yes, elections are about a binary choice between person A and person B. You can choose person C and D, but they ain't going to be president. You voted for Jill Stein, the lady who sat at Putin's table? Well, okay, but she's not going to be president, even if Putin wanted her to be, which he probably did. So the reality is you are making a decision in that voter booth between which of those two major candidates has the preponderance of your views. And yes, part of making that choice is choosing the lesser of two evils, the person who's going to give you health care or take your health care. It's pretty simple. It's either you get the Affordable Care Act with Hillary Clinton or you get Trump, who's demanding that they get rid of it.
And this goes back on the left a long way. I mean,
yeah.
Ralph Nader was saying there's no difference between Bush and Gore.
And God, I mean, if you are an Iraqi, then you're saying, are you kidding me? That Gore and Bush are the same? We went to war in Iraq.
So what brings the left together? Because there is as much, if not more, disorganization on the left as there is clearly in the Republican ranks who can't agree on the specifics of how to screw health care.
I don't know. I mean, I think this has always been, even within the civil rights movement, there was a left-center dynamic, right? The SNCC, young people of SNCC were far to the left of the SCLC people. The only reason SCLC can sort of exert pressure on the John Lewises of the world is that they control the purse strings, and SNCC needed money, and they always got it from SCLC. You had a lot of African-American activists who actually broke from the whole movement. The Black Panthers were one example of a Black Power movement that said, forget all of this, we're going to feed our people, and we're going to have kitchens and make sure the kids are eating, and to hell with politics. So there's always been a left-right dynamic, even in the civil rights movement. I don't know any way of convincing people to do other than what they want to do. All I can say is that the Democratic Party, if they want to rein Trump in and get one of these houses of Congress, had better find enough pragmatic Democrats who are willing to vote for them and go register them to vote. I think that there should actually have been a Summer of Freedom movement, and instead of this weird thing the DNC did where they just rode around getting yelled at by Bernie Sanders voters, they should have been registering voters. There's 700,000 unregistered black voters just in Georgia. Yeah. Who's registering those voters? If you register 1,000 black voters, you get 950 votes for the Democrat. Right. But African Americans are Democrats. The return on investment for voter registration is so much higher than the return on investment for TV ads, but the TV ads get you fees. And so the consultant class in these parties is
most
actually...
Most of them are white men.
Almost all. Yeah. And so the consultant class is locking the parties into this system of buy ads, buy ads, buy ads, instead of register, register, register. The Republicans have an advantage in that their voters are older and they are mostly white, and they are much more reliable voters. They vote in every cycle. So Democrats don't have that advantage. They have to register more voters. You can try to recruit people on the left if you want, try to recruit Trump voters, whatever. I don't think that's a good return on investment. Just go register more people.
We are going to make that the last word. Thank you very much, Joy Scott, Joy Reid, Dred Scott, Ken Ledford. Thanks to Furman. Thanks to Susan and the ACLU. Thanks to all of you for coming. Appreciate it. Vote.
Please. That was fun.